The story of Sandra Lee is often introduced through spectacle, but it begins in something far quieter, a life shaped by discipline, repetition, and an unusual willingness to confront what most people instinctively avoid. By the time she became widely known, she had already spent years building a medical career grounded in dermatology, a field where intimacy and discomfort coexist. What makes her path distinct is not just that she became visible, but that she chose visibility on her own terms, turning clinical reality into something the public could observe without filters or distance. That decision, however, created a second layer to her life, one lived under constant observation. At 55, she is no longer simply a dermatologist or a television figure. She is someone who has lived through the transformation of private work into global attention, and the emotional consequences that come with it. Fame did not replace her identity, it multiplied it, adding expectations, interpretations, and assumptions from millions of viewers. In that space between recognition and reality, her story becomes less about achievement and more about endurance. What remains compelling is not the attention itself, but the question it raises: what does a life become when it is both deeply personal and constantly public at the same time? That tension defines everything that follows. Foundations of a physician who chose the unconventional. Before public recognition, Sandra Lee's life was defined by steady accumulation rather than sudden breakthrough. She pursued medicine through years of training that demanded precision, patience, and emotional resilience. Dermatology, her chosen specialty, placed her in a unique position where science meets human vulnerability. Skin conditions are rarely just physical. They carry emotional weight, shaping confidence, identity, and how people move through the world. She learned early that healing in this field required more than technical skill. It required presence, communication, and a lack of judgment that patients could feel immediately. Working in Upland, California, she built her practice without inherited advantage or institutional prestige. Every step came through repetition and trust earned over time. Her patients were not abstract cases, they were individuals dealing with visible conditions that often affected their self-image more than their health. In this environment, she developed a communication style that was calm, direct, and unexpectedly reassuring. What distinguished her was not ambition in the traditional sense, but attentiveness, the ability to stay with discomfort without flinching or rushing past it. That quality would later become central to her public identity, though at the time, it simply defined her as a physician doing her work with consistency and care. The quiet transition from clinic to camera. The shift from private practice to public visibility did not begin with a plan for fame. It began with curiosity and a sense that medical reality, when shown honestly, might have meaning beyond the clinic. As social platforms evolved, Sandra Lee began to see an opportunity not for performance, but for education. Early recordings of procedures were not designed for entertainment. They were extensions of her clinical work, captured without elaborate production or branding strategy. What followed was unexpected. Viewers responded not with detachment, but with sustained attention. People who had never considered watching medical content found themselves returning, not because of shock alone, but because of clarity. The procedures, while uncomfortable, were presented with calm explanation and respect for the patient. That tone changed everything. Instead of distance, there was connection. Instead of spectacle, there was understanding. Over time, the digital presence grew into something larger than she initially intended. The audience was not simply observing, it was engaging, sharing, and forming communities around what they saw. This shift marked a turning point. Her work was no longer confined to the examination room. It had become a shared experience, one that extended far beyond geography or language. Without abandoning medicine, she had entered a space where education and visibility merged in ways few physicians had attempted before. When medical reality became global attention, as her online presence expanded, so did the scale of its impact. What began as simple educational content evolved into a global phenomenon. Viewers were drawn not only to the procedures themselves, but to the emotional transformation of patients who had often lived for years with conditions that affected their confidence and social lives. The reactions were consistent: hesitation at first, followed by fascination, and then something closer to empathy. This shift in audience behavior created an unusual dynamic. The content was medically grounded, yet emotionally resonant in ways that traditional medical communication rarely achieves. It crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries without relying on translation. People responded to the honesty of what they were seeing and the dignity with which it was presented. As attention grew, so did responsibility. Visibility meant that every detail carried weight. Every interaction became part of a larger narrative constructed by viewers. Yet Sandra Lee did not pivot towards spectacle. Instead, she maintained the same tone she had always used in practice. That consistency became central to her credibility. The result was an audience that did not feel manipulated, but involved. The line between education and engagement blurred, creating a form of medical storytelling that existed in a space few professionals had explored before. The rise of a television phenomenon. The transition to television came when TLC developed Dr. Pimple Popper, bringing her work into a structured, episodic format. What might have been expected as shock-based programming instead became something more grounded. The show retained the clinical reality of dermatological procedures, but its focus remained on people, their discomfort, their vulnerability, and their relief when treatment changed their daily lives. Audiences were not merely reacting to medical visuals. They were witnessing emotional release. Many patients arrived having hidden their conditions for years, avoiding mirrors, photographs, or social situations. The show captured those moments of hesitation and transformation with unusual sensitivity. It was not framed as entertainment alone, but as a record of personal change. For Sandra Lee, the format required balance. Television added structure, production, and narrative framing, but the core responsibility remained unchanged: to treat patients with care and clarity. The success of the show reflected a broader cultural shift toward openness about medical and cosmetic conditions. It also solidified her position as a physician who could operate within both clinical and public spaces without compromising either. The result was not just popularity, but sustained trust across multiple platforms: partnership, privacy, and the life behind the work. Behind her public presence was a long-standing personal life shared with dermatologist Dr. Jeffrey Rebish, a partnership built on shared professional understanding and years of collaboration. Their marriage, spanning decades, was not defined by public visibility, but by parallel careers that often intersected in practice and family life. One partner stepped into the public eye, while the other remained largely outside it, creating a balance that required adaptability rather than performance. Such arrangements are rarely simple. They depend on mutual respect for different thresholds of visibility and the ability to navigate change without allowing it to redefine the relationship entirely. For a long time, this balance appeared stable. Professional success expanded, family life continued, and public attention did not visibly disrupt the structure they had built. Yet the nature of long careers and long relationships is that they evolve independently even when they appear aligned externally. Growth in one area does not always mirror growth in another. Over time, that divergence becomes part of the lived reality, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a gradual reconfiguration of priorities, roles, and emotional space. What once looked fixed becomes something more fluid, shaped by time rather than intention alone. Illness, disclosure, and the decision to speak. A defining shift in Sandra Lee's life came with her breast cancer diagnosis in 2019. Rather than keep it entirely private, she chose to speak openly about it, sharing her experience on her own terms. This decision reflected a consistency in her character, a refusal to separate deeply personal realities from the public honesty she had long practiced in her professional work. She discussed genetic factors, surgical choices, and the emotional complexity of treatment with a clarity that avoided dramatization. The focus was not on framing herself as extraordinary, but on making information accessible and reducing isolation for others facing similar diagnoses. That openness had immediate effects. Viewers responded with their own stories, creating a collective dialogue around illness, prevention, and recovery. Her transparency also carried consequences. Public disclosure during illness means navigating vulnerability under observation, where private recovery intersects with external expectation. Yet she maintained her approach with consistency, treating the experience not as performance, but as shared reality. In doing so, she reinforced the trust she had built over years, turning personal adversity into a form of connection that extended beyond entertainment or education into something closer to communal support. Shifts in midlife and the weight of visibility. As her career continued, the accumulation of success brought a different kind of pressure. Public visibility, once a choice, became a constant condition. Every aspect of life carried interpretation, and even silence became meaningful in the eyes of audiences. At the same time, her personal life was undergoing changes that were not publicly defined, adding another layer of complexity to an already demanding existence. Midlife often introduces reflection that is less about ambition and more about alignment. For someone who has built a career in public view, that reflection is amplified. Questions of direction, privacy, and sustainability become harder to separate from professional identity. Yet she continued to work, maintain her practice, and expand her influence through clinical and educational projects, including skincare development that remained grounded in medical expertise rather than trend cycles. What changed was not output, but orientation. There was a visible shift towards selectivity, how energy was spent, how presence was managed, and how personal boundaries were maintained. This did not signal withdrawal, but recalibration. A life once defined by expansion began to prioritize sustainability, even as external success continued uninterrupted. A career that continues without losing its core. At 55, Sandra Lee exists in a space defined not by resolution but by continuity. Her television work, medical practice, and public presence continue to operate simultaneously, each reinforcing the others rather than competing for relevance. The brand she built through skincare and education remains rooted in clinical knowledge, reflecting a long-term commitment to substance over trend-driven visibility. What distinguishes this phase of her life is not reinvention, but integration. Experiences that once felt separate, medicine, media, illness, privacy, now coexist within a single narrative that is still unfolding. There is no final version of her story, only an ongoing adjustment between public expectation and personal reality. Her influence persists, not because of spectacle, but because of consistency. Patients still arrive seeking help for conditions that affect more than skin. Viewers still engage with content that blends discomfort and care. And beneath all of it is a professional identity that has remained remarkably stable despite external change. The work continues, not as a performance of endurance, but as a continuation of purpose that has not needed to be reinvented to remain relevant. What remains when the cameras move on? The broader significance of Sandra Lee's journey is not found in fame or format, but in persistence. Her story illustrates how a medical career can evolve into public education without losing its ethical center. It also shows how visibility can amplify both opportunity and complexity, especially when personal and professional lives intersect so deeply. At this stage, she does not appear defined by peaks or declines. Instead, she occupies a form of continuity shaped by experience. Illness, success, change, and stability have all contributed to a perspective that is less reactive and more grounded. The result is a presence that feels less like performance and more like practice, an ongoing engagement with work that remains meaningful regardless of scale. Her story continues without a defined conclusion because it was never built around one. It is shaped instead by repetition, showing up, treating patients, communicating honestly, and navigating life as it changes form over time. In that sense, the most important part of her journey is not what has already happened, but what continues quietly, without interruption, in the space between public visibility and private life.